in many respects in response to the revolution.
Oh,
We had
okay.
been counting on the Shah to be a stabilizing force in the region. When he is overthrown and replaced by anti-American radicals, then expectations that we're going to get any help from Iran disappear.
Of
In many
course, yeah.
respects, now the expectation is Iran has become a problem.
Dr. Bacevich, in the last segment, you mentioned the Vietnam War, and as I understand it, you served in the Vietnam War as well. How did our military involvement in Vietnam change our military policy in the Middle East?
Well, indirectly, but
Indirectly.
ultimately significantly. The larger context here is the Cold War. I mean, why did we fight this foolish war
In
in Vietnam?
Vietnam, yeah.
Well, the answer is because it appeared that the essence of the argument was the free world pitted against global communism. That was being that Vietnam was one of the places where this great historic confrontation was going to be decided.
We were going to draw the line there, right?
All that turns out to be malarkey. I mean, in retrospect, it's all malarkey. Nonetheless,
Okay.
Given the mindset of the time, the South Vietnam is deemed a place worth fighting and dying for.
Yeah.
And when that war goes badly, badly would be a understatement.
Yeah.
It leaves the U.S. forces badly demoralized, in terrible shape, and it finds the American people, I think,
Disillusioned.
dismayed,
Yeah.
disillusioned,
Yeah.
and the what we would call the establishment comes out of Vietnam facing a challenge of how to reconstruct the armed forces, restore morale, restore effectiveness, and also restore among the American people a sense of confidence that the U.S. armed forces are competent. It's very hard for us to remember now that by the time back in 1969 or 1970, the U.S. Army, in the eyes of many, perhaps most Americans, looked like the gang that couldn't shoot straight. Everything we did.
But we won World War II. I mean, that's within living memory of people in 1969.
And that was what was supposed to happen in Vietnam, and it sure
Yeah.
the heck didn't. So there is a strong need after Vietnam to try to rebuild the American military, not simply in a substantive sense, but restore confidence in the American military in the eyes of the American people. So the military comes home from Vietnam, and a big question that it faces, that the national security establishment faces. Well, if we're not going to fight in places like Vietnam, where should we be prepared to fight? What kind of forces should the American Army, Navy, Air Force be gearing up for? And the answer they came up with is, well, obviously, we should prepare ourselves to fight the Soviets. Get ready to fight the Red Army.
Yeah.
Not the North Vietnamese army.
Not the proxies, the Red Army itself.
Exactly right. So the United States in the 1970s embarks upon a major reform project to try to restore effectiveness and self-confidence in the American military, with an eye toward the possibility of war with the Soviet Union.
So we're doing this in the 1970s with an eye towards USSR. Right. USSR. And one of our biggest allies in the Middle East is the Shah of Iran, Imperial Iran.
Bingo.
And I want to go back to what you said before, the Carter Doctrine in 1979. Middle East is a region worth fighting and dying for.
Right.
And all of a sudden, you have the Iranian Revolution, 1979, the Ayatollahs, all of them come back. What happens here? First of all, what's the Carter Doctrine? And then,
Okay. So the Carter Doctrine is a statement in a speech by Jimmy Carter, I believe January 1980. Okay.
so
Speech
after
to
the
Congress.
revolution of Iran.
After, in many respects, in response to the revolution,
Oh,
we had
okay.
been counting on the Shah to be a stabilizing force in the region. When he is overthrown and replaced by anti-American radicals, then expectations that we're going to get any help from Iran disappear.
Of
In many
course, yeah.
respects, now the expectation is Iran has become a problem. Almost simultaneously, in December of 1979, the Soviets invade Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Whoa, what's going on here? And the interpretation is that with the United States weakened by Vietnam, the Soviets have now embarked upon an effort to expand their empire, expand it by seizing control of Afghanistan. And then, this is the perception at the time by the Americans, continuing into Iran, arguably towards Saudi Arabia. Why? Why would the Soviets do that? Because of oil. Because by the time we get to the end of the 1970s, everybody understands the strategic importance of oil. The perception is that there is a finite amount of oil, that world supplies are dwindling, and that the prosperity of the United States is dependent upon American access to oil, a point driven home by the oil crises of the 1970s.
Yeah, 1973.
It suddenly appears that American prosperity, even American democracy, is dependent upon access to Middle Eastern oil. And Jimmy Carter responds to that by saying, and therefore, I declare that we will fight for the Persian Gulf.
Oh, wow. That's
Now,
a big statement. That could have, okay.
you think?
I want to make sure I understand this phrase that you used, the statement that you made. We were counting on the Shah. When you say counting, I mean, how big of a military force was Iran?
Well, we were supplying, we were arming arming Iran. I don't know the numbers. It was $1 billion, $2 billion worth of weaponry per year.
That's substantial.
We were training Iranian forces. It was an expectation that Iran, in a sense, would that we could outsource Persian Gulf stability to Iran. We were counting on him to be our policeman on the beat. And of course, when the revolution overturns the Shah's regime, that expectation is demolished. Well, who's going to police the beat? Who's going to maintain stability? Who's going to ensure that the war continues to flow? And the answer that the Carter administration came up with, that's going to have to be us.
You know, as you explain this, Dr. Bacevich, the way that I see the Carter Doctrine, it almost sounds more existential type of worry about than, let's say, Vietnam. Vietnam was a policy of containing the Soviets and fighting the Cold War. But in our eyes, had the Middle East been lost, that may have undermined our country.
Yeah, I don't think I agree with you because, however foolishly, we had persuaded ourselves that freedom itself was at stake in Southeast Asia. That it was a vital interest of the United States to ensure the safety and security of the Republic of Vietnam. Again, in retrospect, nonsense. Didn't appear that way in 1965 when President Johnson begins to Americanize the war. I would argue that the perception of the stakes in the Persian Gulf, in the Middle East, after the overthrow of the Shah and after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan is comparable. It does appear in the eyes of American policymakers, in the eyes of many Americans who were very disturbed by these long gas lines. It appeared that the American way of life, our freedom, was now at stake. And it was that
Well,
perception then that leads the Carter administration and all succeeding administrations to militarize U.S. policy, to begin to gear up to intervene in the region in ways that the U.S. military had never prepared for before.
let me share a personal story with you. I was a kid. It was my cousin's birthday, and the mother of one of the guests rushes in. We were living in Tehran, Iran, and she yells out, "The airport just got bombed. Iraq invaded Iran." Did we know this? Did we help Iraq? There are some stories that we gave the green light to Saddam Hussein, but that's been rebutted. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I don't have any thoughts on the specifics of how the conflict began. I don't know. I mean, clearly it was begun by Iraq, by Saddam Hussein,
yeah.
whose purpose was to seize certain oil fields that were disputed, had long been disputed, I think, between Iran and Iraq. So Saddam looks across the border. He sees the turmoil of the revolution in Iran. And so he says, hey, man, this is going to be easy.
Let me take advantage of this.
I'm going to go grab this low-hanging fruit. And so he initiates the war. The sad part, I think, is that the United States then chooses to take sides. I bet you it's not one American out of 100 actually knows this, but the United States supported Iraq in the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s. It did so by providing intelligence. It did so by providing material wherewithal. It did so by facilitating the sale of weapons to the Iraqi military. We didn't provide any fighter aircraft or tanks, but we provided all kinds of other material support in this horrible war that went on the entire decade.
Why do you say the sad thing? Wasn't Iran suddenly an anti-American government? Doesn't that come natural to us to help?
To me, the sad thing is, I don't remember the number of Iranians and Iraqis who were killed in this war.
I think it was over 1 million, yeah.
Something like that. And it solved nothing. And the United States was complicit. Complicit in supporting Saddam Hussein, who, of course, a decade later, we portrayed as the embodiment of evil. I mean, it's kind of, you can't make it up.
You can't make it up. I want to, in the minute we have left of this segment, Dr. Bacevich, I want to make sure I understand a phrase that you've used, a term to use several times. Establishment. What do you mean by that?
Well, it's probably a term that I shouldn't use. But I do believe that since World War II, over time, in and around Washington, a national security apparatus has come into existence. What does it consist of? Well, it consists of the military. It consists of the civilians who provide oversight to the military, the National Security Council, intelligence agencies, who share a common mindset. And the mindset is one centered, I think, on two things. Number one, the United States has to exercise unquestioned global leadership. And number two, the exercise of global leadership requires military superiority, if not military supremacy. And Vietnam certainly called all of that into question. But the overthrow of the Shah, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, all of that seemed to suggest that American global leadership was weak and that the American military needed to restore itself, to put Vietnam in the rearview mirror, to once again possess unquestioned superiority.
Unquestioned superiority.
And the Middle East was the venue, was one of the venues, maybe the most important venue, when that had to be sorted out in the eyes of the establishment.
I see. Let's take a break here. In the next segment of our conversation, we'll talk about America's military in the Middle East after the Cold War, some of which we already talked about, and after 9/11. And I'll ask Dr. Bacevich this question. On the whole, has our military involvement in the Middle East paid off?